the liberals, Kerby, on the Supreme Court.
Yes, here we go.
Yeah, said, wow, 9-0. And of course, you and I have been saying this, along with others all along, that the Constitution and the law gives a president, any president, tremendous leeway and discretion when it comes to who gets to come into the United States. And the fact that these left-wing judges in the lower federal courts were suggesting that it was against the Constitution for President Trump to do this always struck me as being outrageous. And so this is a good day for the president, but I would argue strongly a good day for the country.
I think a real surprise, too, just a few days ago when we had that 8-0 case on the patents and trademark case. I jokingly say that sometimes you can't get 8 justices to agree that the sky is blue, and in this case 9-0. The only reason the other one was 8-0 is because Neil Gorsuch was not on the court at that time. But I don't know about you, but I've been watching Neil Gorsuch. He wrote a dissent the other day, and he and Clarence Thomas were the 2 dissenting ones. And they were saying, even though what everybody wants to do is fine, we are not legislators, so he declined to approve this. Then in this Trinity case, again, I've read a little bit of what he said. Any concern, Gary Bauer, that Neil Gorsuch is a closet David Souter just flew out the window in the last couple of days, because reading his opinions are exactly what we thought he might be.
Yeah, Kerby, a tip of the hat to you. You got to be one of the quickest guys in America to be reading these cases that just came out a few hours ago.
Well, I have no life.
In order to be able to tell your listeners the latest up-to-date news, and you're absolutely right. I did an interesting thing this morning. I don't do this often, but I did it today. I went over to several left-wing websites just to do a reality check about whether I felt good, legitimately so, about these cases. And on those left-wing websites, Kerby, I never heard so much gnashing of teeth and wailing in your life. It was nice to see the left beginning to conclude that the Supreme Court may be slipping away from them, particularly if a rumor, as you know, that's going around right now, that Justice Kennedy is getting close to retiring. If that comes about, we will see an unbelievable battle to fill that vacancy. And if President Trump is successful again, we would have, I think, a solid majority on the court for almost everything we care about.
Well, again, that's all the more reason to support organizations like American Values as well as Point of View. And one of the things we've done, Gary, is that we've posted one of your end-of-day reports because it relates very much to the appeal letter that I received. And I love how you start with this appeal letter. A Christian was recently attacked because he believes in Jesus Christ. But the attack didn't take place in Cairo or Syria or Iran. It took place in the United States Senate. We have a link to the Sanders slander. But you served for 8 years under the Reagan administration and have been a court watcher and a legislative watcher for many years. I can't think of any nominee for Ronald Reagan, George Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, whatever, that has ever gone through what looked a little bit like a religious inquisition. What did it look like to you?
I think that's exactly what it was. The gentleman that was up for confirmation as a believing Christian had said and written several times that one comes to the Father only through the Son, and that, of course, is Christian theology. And Senator Sanders attacked the nominee and said this is the kind of intolerance that America rejects, and just on and on and on. And I found myself wondering, would Senator Sanders ever make this kind of an attack on a Muslim nominee for a government position? In fact, there were a number of fairly significant posts in government under President Obama filled by Muslims, and I don't recall any senator, right or left, ever daring to question those Muslim nominees about what the specific views were of their theology and how that fitted into the principles of our Constitution. So there's just no doubt about it. There has been a growing hostility to Christianity, a very powerful effort to marginalize Christian belief and to marginalize Christians from the public square.
Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Gary Bauer. By the way, my commentary today is called Ignorance and Intolerance, and it deals with this very issue. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, you might expect a nominee for Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget would be asked about his or her background in economics or experience in government service. Instead, Russell Vought was asked about a theological post that defended a decision made by the administration of Wheaton College. Daniel Davis said that the questioning turned into nothing less than theological interrogation and, in the end, excoriation. David French argued that it showed how religious ignorance breeds progressive intolerance. The questioning by Senators Bernie Sanders and Chris Van Hollen had nothing to do with budgetary issues, but everything to do with the nominee's biblical view of salvation that is through Jesus Christ. Senator Sanders concluded that this nominee is really not someone who this country is supposed to be about. You know, Article 6 of the Constitution prohibits religious tests for public office, but that no longer seems important in this polarized culture today. But even if you do believe that religious convictions of a government employee are fair game, the questioning shows basic religious ignorance. Orthodox Christians believe in the exclusivity of Christ. But the other religions that trace their heritage back to Abraham, that is Judaism and Islam, also have exclusive religious claims. Taken to its logical conclusion, the senator's views would exclude all Orthodox followers of the Abrahamic faith. You know, this ignorance also leads to the intolerance we see today. Elites in the media, government, and the university have contempt for Christians in general and evangelicals in particular. They don't understand Christian theology and don't care to learn about it. If you stray even a little bit from the orthodoxy of the secular left, you will be branded a bigot. This Senate hearing illustrated both the ignorance and intolerance found in many of our elite institutions today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Gary Bauer, President of American Values. We have a link to his end-of-day report. If you haven't already signed up to receive that, let me encourage you to do so. And Gary, one of the other topics that you address both in your end-of-day report as well as in your appeal letter has to do with leaking. And we now know what a few of the leakers are. One of those was the former FBI director. Another one is, I just love this name, Reality Winner. Yes, that really is her name, apparently. But talk about this. This leaking has done such great damage to the credibility of the president and even the possibility of engaging in a coherent foreign policy. And as somebody that's been around Washington, D.C. for many decades, talk about the danger that that actually poses.
Well, Kerby, this is extremely serious, and I mean, I have to admit that when I was watching former FBI Director Comey's testimony, where he just sort of cavalierly indicated that he had leaked a memo to a university professor with the instructions to then go on and leak it again to the New York Times, I was flabbergasted, and I quite frankly expected the senators in the room to react more vigorously than they did at the time. But, of course, this is not the only leak, as you point out. This has been happening from day one of the Trump administration, and not from people that were appointed by Donald Trump, but from people that have been burrowing in all throughout the government, first put in these positions under President Obama, and now doing their best to try to undermine the ability of the president to get his agenda through. Now, look, I understand partisan politics, but these things hurt the country. If a president can't be certain that when he's having a confidential meeting or a meeting involving national security, that things won't be leaked out of the meeting or won't be distorted by people talking about information they're not supposed to be talking about at all, that president almost becomes paralyzed in not knowing what he can say and can't say. And then you mentioned this young woman down in Georgia, apparently a very left-wing woman who had a security clearance, was working for a contractor down there, and took it upon herself to leak additional information. We just had another case last week of another contractor apparently leaking secrets to China. So I think we're in a crisis in this country. It's been going on for a long time, but it's getting worse and worse. And in the dangerous world that we live in, this is making us less secure and putting us in more danger as we go through the years ahead. One
of the questions some of my listeners have wondered is how did, let's use the Georgia woman as an example, Reality Winner, get that level of clearance? Because this is someone who apparently wanted to burn down the White House. Isn't that something she had posted? She wanted to travel to Afghanistan. I mean, this is a little different than an individual that you might say, well, maybe they just had a bad day. This is somebody that obviously has some real concerns about serving in the Trump administration.
Well, America had a bad day when she was given that security clearance, and we're only finding out now how bad of a day it was. Look, I have the same question. She did serve in the United States Air Force for a time and apparently got a security clearance there. Then I'm not sure what year she left the Air Force, but it just seems to me that these security clearances are being given out too easily, and that means the individual that receives that clearance has access to very sensitive information. And, of course, we saw the things that Chelsea Manning ended up leaking and how much that hurt the United States. So, again, this is a trend that's been going on for quite a while, and unless we get it under control, nobody will be happy about this other than America's enemies, who's it's benefiting.
One other point that you make is that it isn't just the left that we're facing. We're facing, of course, the attack from radical Islam. It does seem that the Supreme Court today opened the possibility to vet those individuals coming from other countries, at least those 7 countries. But you also point out that there are open terrorist investigations in all 50 states. So any listener right now, to Point of View, if they're in one of the 42 different states where we broadcast, or in a state where there's an open terrorist investigation in their own area. Mike Pompeo the other day in a recorded message that a number of people hear, so I guess I can say it publicly, it said you would just not even believe the kinds of concerns that the CIA director is finding out about in terms of this. So even though we may feel like there was a victory today in terms of what the Supreme Court did, we have a lot more to do if we're to protect ourselves from radical Muslims. True?
You're absolutely right. Look, last week charges were brought against 2 Hezbollah operatives in the United States. They were arrested in upstate New York in one case, and I think in Dearborn, Michigan in the other. Well, Kerby, one of them was checking out operations and security at U.S. airports and surveilling U.S. military and law enforcement facilities in Manhattan and Brooklyn. The other one was looking for weaknesses at the Panama Canal and determining how close someone could get to a ship passing through the canal. Now, Hezbollah is under the control of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And here were two of Iran's agents through Hezbollah doing this work in the United States, obviously planning for future attacks. All the indications are this is the tip of the iceberg. Are there 100 Hezbollah operatives here, 500, 1,000? We don't know, but if you follow the reports on this, the arrest of such operatives is a fairly regular, ongoing thing. So one can only assume that while it's wonderful that we're getting some of these people, we don't really have any idea of how many more may be inside the United States.
Well, again, as I've said before, this is one of the reasons why I hope that you'll consider supporting American values, and we have a link to ouramericanvalues.org, and we even have the end-of-day report that gives you the documentation for everything we've just talked about. And, of course, you can even get a copy of his appeal letter that goes into that in some more detail. So, Gary, I just wanted, as we get to the end of our fiscal year, also to highlight the great work that you do, because I certainly appreciate the fact that you're sort of, in many cases, our eyes and ears up there in Washington, D.C., and I wanted people to, as they think about supporting Point of View, also think about supporting you.
Kerby, that is incredibly kind of you. I feel like we've had a partnership going for a long time. You've been a great vehicle to get the word out to people that I don't otherwise reach, and if I've been able to provide some information that you find useful, that's music to my ears, and I, as you know, consider you and Point of View to be a national treasure, and I hope, as always, that your annual fundraising is greatly blessed by your loyal listeners.
Well, Gary, thank you so very much. Look forward to the next opportunity. It's been quite a day in terms of the Supreme Court, and we need to be diligent, and thank you for being up there, being the eyes and ears for us and standing up for these very important values every day in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Kerby. Great to be with you.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some other issues. But, of course, along the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, that's 1-800-351-1212. And as we mentioned, of course, we are challenging you as we come to our fiscal year end, which is this Friday, June 30th. If you'd like to join with us and partner with us, we've given you that opportunity. We have a little button there that says Help Bridge the Great Divide, and we have an opportunity for you to give. So go to the website, pointofview.net. And your financial support will help us not only bring this 2-hour radio program to you, but all the news and information. As a matter of fact, your donation will send you the Outlook magazine. We also, of course, have all sorts of videos. My daily commentary, the one today, which is entitled Intolerance and Ignorance, is one that really is an attempt to address that issue that we talked about with Senator Bernie Sanders. So all of that is available to you on a regular basis. And, of course, if we can get your email, we'll send you an occasional update on what's taking place or send you to various articles that would be of help to you. Again, if you would like to talk to someone off air, I know some of you like to go to the computer and deal with that, but if you don't have access to a computer or would just like to talk to someone and know a little bit more about how to help us financially, that pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We really would encourage your financial support. And as I've mentioned on a number of occasions, but let me mention again, we do have a matching challenge because of the generosity of a few of our donors. That means that your gift of any amount will be doubled. So that means a gift of $50 becomes $100. A gift of $100 becomes $200. So again, consider what you might do by going to pointofview.net or give us a call at 800-347-5151.
When you invest in Point of View Radio in July, that's a good thing. The reality is, like you, our bills keep coming every week, every month. But as we close in on the end of June this week, I encourage you to step up now. Number one, because our fiscal year ends Friday, and next year's agenda, the plans we've already developed and hope to accomplish, depend on what happens now. Number two, I encourage you to give now because another listener, one who might have greater means than you or I do, will match what you give, doubling the impact up to $10,000. If you can also give $10,000, we'll put it to very fruitful and good use, and the matching gift will multiply the impact. But whether you give in 5 figures with or without a decimal point, please give this week. Visit pointofview.net and click on Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. We are down to the final days. We need you to step up now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join us on air, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute, we're going to be talking with Dr. Robert Marks, but let me take a phone call left over from the last half hour. Joyce in Texas, KBJS, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
And thank you for having Gary Bauer on. That was very, very nice.
Thank you.
I have a question about treason. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed for treason. Alger Hiss, I mean, lots of folks have gotten, more than a hand slap for selling, our secrets to Russia, China, and whoever else may want them, North Korea for all we know. And I was wondering why change? What precipitated the change and just, okay, you get, 15 minutes in jail and you're free.
Yeah, I think we have prosecuted a few individuals that are still in jail, but there is kind of a softening of some of this. There was a time in which I think the founders intended that we would have impeachment proceedings on a much more regular basis than we've had. Of course, you've had an impeachment proceeding of Bill Clinton, but other than that, and we've had very few attempts to even impeach a Supreme Court justice or federal justice.
But even the people in the military, I mean the soldiers, so to speak.
Yes.
Getting hold of information. And my next question is, why won't they tell us who their insurance is? I saw on TV a lady directly answer, "Who gives you your insurance?" And it just blew her off, would not answer. And I'm curious myself.
Okay, so you're talking about, again, how do individuals that are federal employees get their insurance? Well, they get what are called the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program. Now, Joyce, if you were listening a number of years ago, we had Representative Michael Burgess, who is a doctor but also a member of Congress, point out that when Obamacare first was passed, or the Affordable Care Act, that they were also under Obamacare. That didn't last very long because they found a little if you will, loophole that allowed them to go back to a much better system. And again, my argument has always been, and we'll leave it there, but I'll take some more phone calls in just a few minutes after our interview with Dr. Marks. My argument has always been that if you're an elected representative, you should live under the same laws as everyone else. We understand when you have to live under the same laws, but you should also, I would argue, have to live under the same programs as anyone else. So if Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is good enough for the American people, it should be good enough for members of Congress and federal employees. Of course, that's not the case. So I think you've asked a very good question. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But let me bring to the microphone Dr. Robert Marks. He is a distinguished professor of electrical and computer engineering at Baylor University. By the way, co-author of a new book, Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics, and this is published by World Scientific. Individual, by the way, that has really been kind of following this whole issue of intelligent design. But the other day, there was a question being raised about whether or not these computers that are being developed now that are actually they're really so much more sophisticated, so much faster, that some scientists are saying, well, we're getting to the day where these supercomputers have kind of human-like capabilities, like awareness and emotions. And whether it's Elon Musk or Bill Gates or a variety of others, they've been really concerned about this. Stephen Hawking has even talked about the concern about artificial intelligence. So I thought I would bring an expert in the field to this discussion. If for no other reason, if you've watched too many Terminator movies or Matrix movies, you might be concerned about this. So, Dr. Robert Marks, thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. Thank you for inviting me.
Again, I wanted to get into this. First of all, give us a sense of how sophisticated these computers are becoming, because with this advent of artificial intelligence, we no longer have to control them. They, in many cases, can control themselves. We can put a rover on Mars, and it can be able to make some good, quote, decisions like a human being would make in order to find the best path to do an investigation or to, in some cases, even be able to fix itself.
Well, indeed, I think that electrical engineering and control engineers and artificial intelligence can do things which are adaptive. They're able to adapt to their environment, but I would argue that that's probably a good example of design, not of anything which is creative.
Yes, and again, a lot of this relates very much to this idea of intelligent design. But let's go to how you would even be able to determine that. Many of us may have seen the movie about Dr. Turing, and there's been this Turing test. But talk about that. Is it possible to really even test a computer to determine whether or not it's achieved capabilities as human being? In other words, if I had one human being at a terminal and then a computer at the other, would there be a way eventually that I could determine whether or not I'm communicating with a human being or communicating with a computer?
Well, this was Alan Turing's dream. In fact, the name of the movie that you're talking about that starred, and I don't know if I can say his name, Benedict Cumberbatch, I believe it was.
That's
Same
right.
guy that played Dr. Strange and Sherlock Holmes, was about Alan Turing, but the name of the movie was called The Imitation Game. And it was Turing's goal to actually show that a computer could replicate a human being, could, if you will, imitate a human being. And he proposed the idea of the Turing test way back in the 1930s. And his basic idea was that if you were to sit on one side of a curtain and a computer was to sit on the other side, and you were to go back and forth, could you tell whether the person on the other side or the computer on the other side was a computer, or was it a or was it a person? And there have been a number of attempts to pass the Turing test. The most recent that I'm familiar with is with a program called Eugene Goostman, who fooled about 33% of his interrogators into thinking it was human. However, Turing's original idea is now being recognized as a test for so-called soft AI. Soft AI is kind of what computers can do. Hard AI is the ability of the computer to actually replicate the features that we see in human beings, like creativity and understanding and
Yes.
consciousness and self-aware. And a great researcher at Rensselaer Polytechnic, Bringsjord, said it very nicely. I'm reading now the quote. Though progress towards Turing's dream is being made, it's coming only on the strength of clever but shallow trickery. In other words, the people that write these programs to pass the Turing test are gaming the system in order to make it work. So Bringsjord proposed something called the Lovelace test after Ada Lovelace. She was the first computer programmer back in the 19th century who also said that computers cannot be creative or anything. But here, the basic idea is very simple. Does the computer do something? Does the computer create to such an extent that it cannot be explained by the person that wrote the code? And if a computer program passes that test, the Lovelace test, then it is truly hard artificial intelligence. And we are nowhere near that.
Yes, and that was kind of the premise of The Matrix, where it's writing its own code, or some of the others. What about this idea of artificial intelligence? I mentioned that just a minute ago. Stephen Hawking is very concerned that artificial intelligence could spell the doom or the end of the human race. I think of the movie I, Robot, and you have Will Smith in there. There's a sense that some people are concerned that once we get artificial intelligence, once we get robots, they're going to take over our planet and eventually extinguish all of us human beings. What are your thoughts?
Well, I believe that artificial intelligence and computers are going to have an incredible impact on our society. My goodness, they have already, and they will continue to do so. But it is simply an introduction of a new technology. And the technology itself is not good or bad. It's how we manage it. It's, again, like any technology. So that's going to be the key, is how do we manage this? Will the computer ever become self-conscious or self-aware? No, I think that there is very strong evidence against this. And I'm not the only one. For example, Roger Penrose, who wrote about the Penrose-Hawking black hole singularity, really smart guy, wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind, which is a difficult read, but it turned me on to this viewpoint that computers cannot be creative like human beings. And I also read a recent little article by the director of the Whitting School's Robot and Protein Kinematics Lab at Johns Hopkins University, who says robots will never be able to exhibit any form of creativity or sentience. So I believe that anybody that actually looks at this with a technical background recognizes the limitations of the computers. And yes, computers are getting faster, they have more memory, but the computers that we have now are no better in a sense than the computers we had back in the 60s. In fact, with Turing's original machine back in the 30s. They're faster, they can do things 1,000,000 times as fast, but if you go back to Turing's original machine, you can do exactly the same thing as we do on today's computers. It's going to take you a heck of a longer. And the reason that's important is we can go back and look at the limitations of Turing's machine and find out the limitations of today's computers.
Very good. Let's take a break, and we will continue our conversation with Dr. Robert Marks. By the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to have a bit of an open line in the second hour, but in case you have some questions about this. Also, we can learn some things from his new book that he has co-authored with Bill Dembski and others, Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. We'll talk about what that means right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. $3.25 million. That's the price one New Jersey town will pay for its religious discrimination. Not long ago on this program, I told you about the refusal of Bernards Township, New Jersey, to grant a building permit to the Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey. The society fought City Hall for at least 4 years, having their application denied 9 separate times. In November 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the township, alleging a violation of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The Department of Justice won just 2 months later. But by May 2017, the township decided to give up the fight, settle with the government, and allow the Islamic Society to build their mosque. This is good news for religious liberty. Though Bernards Township, in this case, used their zoning laws to prevent the building of a mosque, it could have just as easily been a synagogue, a church, a cathedral, or other house of worship. City governments cannot intentionally throw up permitting obstacles to religious organizations. They must treat a religious organization's application for land use just like it would any other land use application. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes Dr. Robert Marks, and again, he is a distinguished professor of electrical and computer engineering at Baylor University. By the way, if you have a copy of my book, A Biblical Point of View on Intelligent Design, I have a section in there in which I told the story about Dr. Marks, in which he actually put together an evolutionary informatics lab to examine whether or not Darwinian processes like, say, mutation and natural selection could generate new information. Of course, then there was all sorts of controversy surrounding that. But the good news is it's resulted in a book called Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. And it is co-authored not only by you, but Bill Dembski and Winston Ewart and others. And this is really, without getting into all the technical detail, a way to determine whether or not this idea of intelligent design makes sense. In other words, can mutation, natural selection, can randomness give us order? I think intuitively, Dr. Marks, we know that that can't happen, and you have a lot more mathematical and engineering specificity to give us the same kind of conclusion, don't you?
Well, I think so. I think that Bill Dembski and Winston and I worked together for about 10 years. We published a lot of our stuff in peer-reviewed archival journals and conference papers, but that was kind of written towards the nerd, had a lot of mathematics and very deep sort of technical stuff in it. So what we decided to do is to take that list of papers and write it in a way that's more accessible to the public. And that was the genesis of the idea for Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. So we explain it. There's a little bit of mathematics. It's not an easy read. If you want an easy read, go buy a John Grisham novel or something like that. But if you really want to learn something, get a hold of Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. The beginning of it, the beginning of the book actually analyzes the evolutionary programs put forth by the neo-Darwinists purporting to illustrate neo-Darwinian evolution. In fact, one of the programs called Avita was co-authored by Robert Pennock, who was one of the people that testified in the Dover-Kitzimer trial. He came up and said, yeah, not only do we have a computer program that can do evolution, evolution is actually happening. And what we've done is shown that in all cases that we have looked at, that the programmer has snuck information through the back door, design information, if you will, to guide the evolutionary process to the desired result. And we made, I think, some very interesting contributions. We can actually measure the degree to which a program is assisted in something called active information. So we can measure how much outside information has been smuggled in, and we can do so in bits. And part of the book deals with looking at these programs, showing that indeed external information is being smuggled in, and showing not only the location of that extra information, but actually measuring the information in bits. We've done so for Avita, for EV, and a number of other programs put forward by the neo-Darwinists. And our conclusion is very simple. There exists no model for successfully describing undirected Darwinian evolution. So Darwinian evolution is currently not a hard science. It's still a soft science. Hard sciences like physics and such have mathematics to support it.
That's right. And again, I think the point for our listeners, without getting into the mathematics, but again, I will certainly recommend the book because you can skip across some of those areas in your book and at least see the conclusions. But the bigger issue is that when people hear, well, now we have computer simulations that prove evolution is true, it's amazing because if a computer generates this conclusion, then people tend to accept it. These are sometimes the same people that say, yeah, but you have computer simulations right now that say that the Earth should be a lot warmer than it is right now, and you have computer simulations that predicted that the stock market would go up and it crashed, and a variety of other issues. So, but nevertheless, I think it's just, again, a wise evaluation of this. And when you look at these simulations or these attempts to try to explain how very random processes could give you anything that would look like an actual intelligent system, self-replicating system, you begin to see that most of the evidence still is in the hands of those people that believe in intelligent design, not random chance evolution.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, I don't know if you've seen the movie Dumb and Dumber, where they have the Lloyd Christmas telling Mary Swanson that what are his chances with her, and she says 1 in a million, and everybody laughs because it's stupid, because Lloyd Christmas's response is, so you're telling me there's a chance.
There's a chance.
And this is kind of, yeah, so you're telling me there's a chance. And this is the sort of response that we get from the Darwinists, that, yeah, so you're telling me a chance. One of the things we do in the book, by the way, just a side note, we have marked off the book, motivated by Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box, we have marked off the technical sections.
Right.
So people can read through it without, so you can skip over them. But we have actually looked at the probabilistic resources of our universe and even the hypothetical multiverse. And we have looked at probabilities, and we have shown that the probabilistic resources of the universe or the multiverse are not enough to show the specified complexity we observe every day.
Amazing.
And there are things which are possible. When I'm typing, there's something in quantum mechanics called quantum tunneling. If I hit my space bar with my thumb, there's a finite chance that my thumb is going to quantum tunnel through the space bar and get stuck there. But that ain't going to happen. The probabilities are so small. It's called Borel's Law. Borel's Law says that there is a point when things become so improbable, you have to say they're impossible.
That's right. Well, again, you got to love Dr. Marks, because not only do we quote from The Terminator and The Matrix and I, Robot, but Dumb and Dumber, so nothing else. I know the students probably love you, and again, I wanted to encourage people to find out a little bit more. We have a link to your website, so people can, if they want to go to Robert Marks, find out a little bit more about this, because it is, again, available. Just click on his button there, and it takes you to robertmarks.org. There's a virtual office there, so you can find out about some of these books. If you have somebody that is in your community that would like to read about this, I think it is readable. If you have high school math, I think you can follow it. If, again, this is something you'd like to know more about, or you know a young person that's really interested in computers or artificial intelligence, again, we wanted to give you that opportunity to be exposed to Dr. Robert Marks. So I've mentioned you in one of my books. I am just thrilled that you are on the program with us today, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Well, thanks, Kerby. I would also mention we do have a website devoted directly to our intelligent design work, and there's a link to it on my webpage, but that's evoinfo.org, evoinfo.org. My wife says it sounds like evil info, but it isn't. It's evoinfo, evoinfo.org. And there you can download all of our papers if you want to get down and dirty with the mathematics and the modeling and such.
Yeah, evoinfo.org. It's the third one on the left-hand side of the robertmarks.org. Yes. So, Robert, thank you for joining us today. Look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you, Kerby. It was fun.
Let's take a break. I thought for those of you that have been hearing all the fear about supercomputers and artificial intelligence and robots taking over our lives, or maybe the argument that computer simulations have proved in evolution, well, you heard right here at Point of View. Just might want to take that with a grain of salt. How about a huge bag of salt? Because some of this is just bizarre in terms of some of the kinds of claims being made. Second hour, I want to have an open line for a while, and then we'll get into a couple of issues in the news. But just before we do so, let me again encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. We cover so many different topics here, and we really are equipping you to take a stand in the culture, to understand these ideas from a biblical point of view, to really cut through some of the clutter of information and misinformation. So if you value what we do here on Point of View, let me encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Give Now, and make a generous gift before the end of our fiscal year, which is on Friday, June 30th. Or as we go to a break, you might want to call someone on our pledge line. That number is 800-347-5151. We'd love to hear from you. Of course, you can write to us as well. Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Any way you do so, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll be back with more right after this.
When you invest in Point of View Radio in July, that's a good thing. The reality is, like you, our bills keep coming every week, every month. But as we close in on the end of June this week, I encourage you to step up now. Number one, because our fiscal year ends Friday, and next year's agenda, the plans we've already developed and hope to accomplish, depend on what happens now. Number two, I encourage you to give now because another listener, one who might have greater means than you or I do, will match what you give, doubling the impact up to $10,000. If you can also give $10,000, we'll put it to very fruitful and good use, and the matching gift will multiply the impact. But whether you give in 5 figures with or without a decimal point, please give this week. Visit pointofview.net and click on Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. We are down to the final days. We need you to step up now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track, and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. This hour, I wanted to have a little bit of an open line for your comments for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we had one call last hour, what about this issue of the repeal and replace of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and what about this particular Senate version that is different from the House version? Is there a possibility that we will have a change in health insurance? The answer probably is not in the near future, because even some of the senators are saying maybe it's time to go slow and to think carefully about this. Of course, soon they will be going on another recess, which I think is something they don't need. How much has Congress really been able to accomplish so far? There are many that are suggesting that they just need to work their way through the summer and through the fall and get the work done. But we'll see. But that's one of the issues certainly we wanted to put on the table. The Supreme Court, just before it headed out of town, had a couple of very important decisions. We mentioned those briefly with Gary Bauer, but I wanted to get into those in a little more detail. And in the last half of this hour, we're going to be talking with Rahim Kassam, and he has a new article out called "The New Uncle Toms: Islamist and Leftist Target Reformist and Ex-Muslims with a Racial Epithet." You might remember that the idea of an Uncle Tom at one point had a positive connotation, now has a very negative one, and it is used as a way for Muslims who are radical to criticize moderate Muslims or ex-Muslims or those who want to reform Islam. So we want to talk about that, but he also has a new book coming out in just a few months. Matter of fact, when he comes out in August, I want to get him back on here because it's got this very provocative title, No-Go Zones: How Sharia is Spreading in America. He, by the way, is the editor-in-chief of Breitbart in London, but he happens to be in Washington, D.C. right now, so we won't have to spend quite so much money for that phone call. But just before we get to him at the bottom of the hour, I wanted to hear from you right now, 1-800-351-1212. If you're just joining us, and it's quite possible that you are, a couple of very important cases that I wanted to mention. The first has to do with this issue of religious liberty. This coming from the Washington Post. The Supreme Court concluded its work for its session on Monday, siding with religious institutions in a major church-state decision, and with no indication that Justice Anthony Kennedy will be retiring. Now, that may not mean a lot. Yeah, the last day might be a time when you could announce your retirement, but you can remember some other justices waited until the summer to make that announcement. But so far, there's been some speculation he might step down. He has not done so. But let's get back to the case. This was a case that was ruled 7-2, and it has to do with Trinity Lutheran Church in Columbia, Missouri. It's a state program that allows them and various opportunities, if you have a playground, to reimburse the cost of rubberizing the surface of the playgrounds. They use recycled tires. And so that has been something that has been available to other groups, but because this was a religious group, they were denied even though they qualified for this particular benefit. So what actually ended up happening is it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in this particular case. And as we get to some of the phone calls in just a minute, I will go into some more detail about it if you would like, or of course we can go in other directions. I suspect some of you want to talk about health care. But if you do go into this, one of the things I thought was so intriguing, and I mentioned this to Gary Bauer, is we've been sort of watching this new Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. And in this particular case, there are a couple of footnotes where he and Justice Thomas agree. And one of the footnotes, which is written by both of them, says this case involves express discrimination based on religious identity with respect to playground resurfacing. We do not address religious uses of funding for other kind of discrimination. But then in another note, Neil Gorsuch says, we cannot see why the First Amendment's free exercise clause should care. Because he says, after all, the clause guarantees the free exercise of religion. In the Constitution and believing in the express written intent of the Constitution is exactly what he's going to use to go by. So he is going to be, I think, an individual that holds to originalism or strict constructionism, whatever you might call it. And we see this in this particular case more in some of the footnotes, if you will, in Trinity Lutheran Church. But we see it also in his dissent from a case that's really not very important to you as a listener, but it does, again, give us a little bit of an idea of how Neil Gorsuch would rule in other cases, because it's a case known as Perry versus the Merit Systems Protection Board. It's not one that's really that important. It has to do with an individual that was a census taker, and he wanted some of the laws and the regulations rewritten. And I thought it was so interesting because in this particular note and this dissent, which was written by Neil Gorsuch, and he and Clarence Thomas were the two dissenting voices, he said, if a statute needs repair, he says, there's a constitutionally prescribed way to do it. It's called legislation. To be sure, the demands of bicameralism, that is having both a House and a Senate, and presentment are real and the process can be protracted. But the difficulty of making new laws isn't some bug in the constitutional design, it's the point of the design, the better to preserve liberty. And I thought it was so interesting because he even goes on a little bit later to say, you know, this man, Mr. Perry, would like us to tweak a constitutional statute just a little bit so that it works more efficiently. And he said, no doubt his invitation is well-meaning, but it's one we should decline all the same. Not only is the business of enacting statutory fixes one that belongs to Congress and not this court, but taking up his invitation also seems to spell disaster. So what you see once again with Neil Gorsuch is saying, wait a minute, I understand that it's difficult to make laws, but that's what the founders intended. They intended it to be difficult to make a law. It had to go through both the House and the Senate, and then it could be vetoed by the president, and the only way that you could override the veto is with a certain number of votes. And I recognize that sometimes there's a tendency for the courts to want to fix something. Maybe the law wasn't written quite well, or it didn't anticipate this particular issue. But that's not the responsibility of the court. That's the responsibility of the legislature. America, you can sleep more soundly with somebody like Neil Gorsuch in the Supreme Court. It's just amazing to me how on so many cases, even conservatives, recognizing this one case we're talking about, it was 7-2, so that means that except for Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, all the others, both liberal and conservative, said, yeah, we'll just fix the law. Nope, he wanted to resist even trying to fix the law because that's not the role of the Congress, that's not the role of the court, it's the role of Congress. And so I think it's kind of intriguing to see how over the last few weeks we've begun to understand that he really was a very good nominee, and I think will serve with distinction in the Supreme Court. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I'll take some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We have this case having to do with religious liberty. We have, of course, a case that now goes forward, a 9-0 so far, simply saying that, yes, we will not wait any longer. We will allow President Trump to have this travel ban for these 7 particular countries. And then when we come back, there's also a win, if you will, for same-sex couples coming from the Supreme Court as well. So we've got a lot of issues to cover. We will do so and give you a chance to join the conversation at 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, you might expect a nominee for Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget would be asked about his or her background in economics or experience in government service. Instead, Russell Vought was asked about a theological post that defended a decision made by the administration of Wheaton College. Daniel Davis said that the questioning turned into nothing less than theological interrogation and, in the end, excoriation. David French argued that it showed how religious ignorance breeds progressive intolerance. The questioning by Senators Bernie Sanders and Chris Van Hollen had nothing to do with budgetary issues, but everything to do with the nominee's biblical view of salvation that is through Jesus Christ. Senator Sanders concluded that this nominee is really not someone who this country is supposed to be about. You know, Article 6 of the Constitution prohibits religious tests for public office, but that no longer seems important in this polarized culture today. But even if you do believe that religious convictions of a government employee are fair game, the questioning shows basic religious ignorance. Orthodox Christians believe in the exclusivity of Christ. But the other religions that trace their heritage back to Abraham, that is Judaism and Islam, also have exclusive religious claims. Taken to its logical conclusion, the senator's views would exclude all Orthodox followers of the Abrahamic faith. You know, this ignorance also leads to the intolerance we see today. Elites in the media, government, and the university have contempt for Christians in general and evangelicals in particular. They don't understand Christian theology and don't care to learn about it. If you stray even a little bit from the orthodoxy of the secular left, you will be branded a bigot. This Senate hearing illustrated both the ignorance and intolerance found in many of our elite institutions today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia. Barry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Barry, do we have you there?
Yes, I am.
Yes, go ahead. We'd love to hear from you today.
Yes, I'm kind of anxious about our country and our future. It seems as though our president has currently placed himself as the champion of the anti-Obama, as opposed to running the country and keeping the finances of running the country in view, as opposed to trying to undo so many things that have been done before.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's an either or. I'd say it's a both and. First of all, this is, I think, one of those times where we didn't have either candidate for the presidency when we finally had the nominees who talked anything at all about the finances, other than, of course, you may have had a little bit about starting jobs and things like that. But when you're at $20 trillion in debt, I think you really do have to pay attention to the economic issues. And even later this week, we're going to spend some time talking with Chuck Bentley of Crown Financial about what this might mean if we don't deal with some of the financial issues. On the other hand, I do believe that there were some policies implemented, and not just to put those at the feet of President Obama, but also Congress, because you had both Republican and Democratic Congresses that have done things that have made that worse. So I think sometimes you do need to undo some policies that that prevent economic growth, various kinds of restrictions and things of that nature. But at the same time, I agree with you. I think there has been almost no talk, hopefully you've heard us talk about it, about the financial implications of a country that simply cannot get its finances in order. And this is, I think, a real concern and something that I appreciate you bringing up.
I believe you've said it all in the nutshell.
Well, I don't know if I did, but just to make a Barry's point for just a minute, think about it this way, because if you really begin to consider what we are doing from a financial point of view, we this year probably will spend $3.9 trillion, but we will only bring in $3.3 trillion. And that's because we've had just a phenomenal amount that has come in almost unexpectedly, if we could be perfectly blunt about this, in terms of some unexpected revenues. So if we can't get our financial house in order, there are going to be consequences. And I try to sometimes change this a little bit so that you can understand it. Just let me take some zeros off, and imagine you have somebody who makes $33,000 a year, but they're spending $39,000 a year. And you'd say, Guy, you're spending $6,000 a year more than you're bringing in. You can't keep doing this indefinitely. And he says, well, it's not just that, but I've got about $200,000 in credit card debt. At this point, you'd go, what? I can't even believe what you are putting yourself into. Now, I'll recognize that the United States government is different than an individual. But if you take the zeros off, that's really what we're talking about. It's like a person that is bringing in $33,000 a year, but spending $39,000 a year, and has run up so much debt that the possibility of even paying those debts off are completely out of the question. And that's the world that we find ourselves in. So then, I hope you remember that each time you have a situation in which somebody says, well, we need to spend more money, and you need to stop them right there. Wait a minute, we're broke. Matter of fact, as I've said before, we're not broke. We're $20 trillion past broke. And so when people say, well, we can't cut, well, you're gonna have to do a lot of cutting, we're just not talking about cutting Planned Parenthood or the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Legal Services Corporation. If you want to even get close to something that looks like a balanced budget, something we haven't had since the 1990s, and even then it wasn't technically balanced, but at least it was the closest we've ever come in recent memory, then you're going to have to do a lot more cutting and a lot more ways to generate income. And, of course, there are some possibilities. This president has talked about providing an opportunity to repatriate tens of trillions of dollars perhaps, but lots of trillions of dollars anyway, of money that's overseas by changing the tax code and some other things. So anyway, Barry's got a good point. Let's start figuring out how to get our economic house in order. And I think one of the reasons sometimes people don't pay attention to it is these numbers, your eyes just sort of blur over when that takes the cakes. And then, as we'll talk about with Chuck Bentley later this week, also, we recognize that some of us don't want to point our finger at a government that can't balance its budget, since a lot of us can't balance our budget either. So let me come back to this in just a minute, but I wanted to talk about one other Supreme Court case that you might not have heard of, but it's one that we'll maybe talk a little bit more about on Wednesday when Chelsea Yeoman's with us, because she'll be part of our roundtable. But today, the Supreme Court also struck down a law in Arkansas that treated same-sex couples differently, because there was a question as to whether or not the same-sex couples could have their names on birth certificates. And the ruling came from the court with one justice's authorship, but both Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Samuel Alito, and Justice Neil Gorsuch dissented. So it was a little different kind of case, but it had to do with an attempt to actually list the non-biological spouse on a newborn's birth certificate. We can have this debate as to whether or not we want to treat same-sex couples and same-sex marriage the same as normal traditional marriage, but it is just a bit bizarre when typically on a birth certificate you have the father and the mother who provided the genetic material and the mother who provided the genetic material. When you have a non-biological spouse on a newborn's birth certificate, I just think that this is a decision by the Supreme Court that makes no sense. But nevertheless, we'll get into that a little bit later and probably spend some time talking about that on Wednesday. Let me also mention that as we talked about with Gary Bauer in the first hour, my commentary today is entitled Ignorance and Intolerance, and it has to do with the story we mentioned in the first hour, but you might have missed it, about the whole situation in which Russell Vought, who as a deputy director nominee for the Office of Management and Budget, was not asked about his background in economics or his experience in government, but instead was asked about a letter that he wrote to affirm his former alma mater, Wheaton College. And Senator Bernie Sanders asked him all sorts of religious questions. And of course, we have Article 6 in the Constitution that says there should not be a religious test for public office. Nevertheless, Bernie Sanders concluded that this nominee is really not someone who this country is supposed to be about. And Senator Chris Van Hollen expressed his concern as well. So if nothing else, it illustrates again that when you don't understand some of these religious issues, it oftentimes leads to intolerance. Let's take another phone call, though. We'll go to Susan in Texas. Susan, thank you for calling today here on Point of View.
Yes.
You have the floor. What would you like to mention?
Oh, well, I just told it to her. I'm sorry. I'll say it again. I said when you're talking about revenue for the country, how about not cutting taxes to the millionaires and billionaires, as the country needs that revenue?
Well, and again, one of the things that I've tried to point out on here before is if you look at like the so-called top 10% of those people in terms of revenue, they pay actually 38% of the taxes. The top 5% pay 58%. So it's not like we aren't taxing them rather dramatically. And if you look at the top 10%, that's 69% of the revenue. So most of the revenue actually does come from that top 1%, the top 5%, or the top 10%. And so, again, even the other day, as we did as kind of an economic experiment, let's just imagine you could take every dime from every millionaire and billionaire. It still wouldn't come close to even helping to close the gap, which is why when you hear people say, well, let's tax the rich, the reality is most of the money is still going to have to go all the way down to the middle class. That is those of us around the table as well. But good question, and maybe we'll get into some of those economic issues in the future, because that certainly was something I love to do as an exercise to help us understand a little bit more about some of those economic issues. And as a matter of fact, when Chuck Bentley joins us on Thursday, let's talk about that. We'll give him a chance to help us understand where is the money, where is the revenue, and what could we possibly do as a country to eventually get even close to balancing the budget. But since we're taking a break, let me just mention again that we are challenging you to consider what you might do in your financial resources to contribute to this ministry. So I would certainly want to encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. And if you haven't had a chance to give us a call, the pledge line number, which is different than the on-air number I just gave a minute ago, is 800-347-5151. We come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with Rahim Qassam, individual that has really been looking at this issue of Islam. We'll be right back.
When you invest in Point of View Radio in July, that's a good thing. The reality is, like you, our bills keep coming every week, every month. But as we close in on the end of June this week, I encourage you to step up now. Number one, because our fiscal year ends Friday, and next year's agenda, the plans we've already developed and hope to accomplish, depend on what happens now. Number two, I encourage you to give now because another listener, one who might have greater means than you or I do, will match what you give, doubling the impact up to $10,000. If you can also give $10,000, we'll put it to very fruitful and good use, and the matching gift will multiply the impact. But whether you give in 5 figures with or without a decimal point, please give this week. Visit pointofview.net and click on Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. We are down to the final days. We need you to step up now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We were supposed to have with us Rahim Kasim, and because of some phone issues, and again, he is an individual that actually is related very much to Breitbart in London. He is in Washington, D.C. right now, but we weren't able to make a connection. Let me just read a little bit from his piece and then, again, open up the lines for your comments. And it maybe helps understand another issue. Some of you have asked, well, if indeed there are moderate Muslims, if there are Muslims that are reformist, if there are former Muslims who really do want to bring about a change in the perspective that is happening right now that oftentimes leads to radicalization, why don't we hear more from them? And in his particular piece, which is well titled, "The New Uncle Toms, Islamists, Leftists Target Reformists and Ex-Muslims with Racial Epithet." And what he's talking about is simply this, that sometimes they get the phrase that they're a coconut, black on the outside, or Muslim on the outside but white on the inside, or that they're an Uncle Tom. And he reminds us that Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, dealt with the issue of blacks in America. And he said that when it first came out, today nobody wants to be called an Uncle Tom, but he says 150 years ago it was a compliment. Uncle Tom was a martyr, not a sellout. His devotion to his fellow slaves is so unshakable that he sacrifices a chance for freedom and ultimately his life to help them. Well, most of you, if you've never read the book, don't probably know too much about it, but you may have heard the phrase. And the point he's making is here is an individual out of the UK who, because of his Muslim background, gets labeled this way so often. And he says, I have a pretty thick skin. I hear these things every day. I feel ashamed, not of who I am, but of my fellow human beings who find it appropriate to race shame someone or religion shame someone. He says, I'm told every day, perhaps even several times a day, that I'm a coconut, or I hear the sardonic express of how proud my parents must be of me. Of course, that's done with a great deal of sarcasm. And he says, I can take it. When it comes to from Muslims, I put this down to envy, a green-eyed monster and the green Arab-clad flags to coordinate well together. But I recall vividly an incident from my early days in politics, he says. And this again is Rahim Kasim, in which he says, I was so excited to be trotting around the House of Commons with a Labour Party friend of mine I had met at the Sports and Social Bar, more commonly referred to as a Sports and Socialist. We had a few beers, went for a walk around the parliamentary estate. I guess I was 23 years at the time. In a moment of unguardedness, my new friend turned to me in the hallway and said something to the effect, Rahim, you should be one of us. Flattered for a moment, I thought, well, this guy's trying to recruit me because he sees talent. But he continued before I could say anything. Yeah, you're brown, your parents are immigrants, you should be one of us. I was stunned, offended even, and that's pretty hard to achieve. The idea that I should vote a certain way or think in a certain manner simply because of the color of my skin or the religion of my great-great-grandparents happened to convert to. He later apologized, of course, realizing his area, and said, well, we could blame it on the beer. But the point he was making is there was an assumption. There's assumption made about race. There's assumption made about Muslims in the UK that, of course, you're going to support the most liberal policies. And if you, by chance, hold to anything that could be perceived as part of the Conservative Party agenda, you know what happens. Then you start getting the labels. Well, anyway, let me continue on. He says, I've been accused of being a traitor to my race. I've been accused of being a betrayer of Islam. I suspect those who accuse me of the latter know precisely what they're doing. They know what the punishment for apostasy is. When the Iranian Human Rights Commission, an organization in the Senate Intelligence Committee, decided to appoint me an Islamophobe in the year 2014, they knew they were putting a target on my head. And again, you have to understand, it's one thing if you're African American and called an Uncle Tom, you might not receive the kind of accolades from your peers that you might expect. But there's a real difference when you call, if you will, a Muslim, a reformist Muslim, or a former Muslim an Uncle Tom, because that makes you an apostate, and that means you might be killed for your particular view. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say, by and by, the same group, the BBC and the UK government, fawned to follow the attack near Finsbury Park Mosque in June of 2017. Never mind, I thought. Instead, I owned it, splashed it across the pages of Breitbart London. But for people of weaker will, perhaps those who grew up not reading Christopher Hitchens' Letters to a Young Contrarian, or to those who are reliant on their families for housing or for child support, or even those who are simply ill-prepared, this assault on identity, he says, can be devastating, especially when it's endorsed by leading figures. Well, he goes on in this article, which we've posted here, to really help you understand the incredible pressure that is put upon moderate Muslims. So often we have some of you call in and say, well, if there are moderate Muslims out there, if there are Muslims who want to bring about the reform of their religion, where are they? And I think, if nothing else, Rahim Kassam really helps us understand that there is a very significant price to pay, not just in terms of social attacks that you might receive, not just in terms of name-calling, but this one perhaps even worse, because it could easily put a price on your head and could be a death warrant. So again, we'll get him on when we can work out some of the phone connections, but he has a book coming out in just Spreading in America, and he's also, as I mentioned before, the editor-in-chief of Breitbart London, and it's just, I think, a very powerful statement as to the price that can be paid very easily if you find yourself standing up for some kind of reformation of the Muslim religion and Muslim ideology. So again, we'll get him on in the future, and you can find out more about this by going to our website, pointofview.net. Just before we take another break, let me mention something else that has been in the news quite a bit. We mentioned it briefly on Friday, but I thought it would be worth mentioning a little bit further. And that is one place that I have found where people oftentimes go to check out a ministry or a charity is a place called GuideStar. And it is described oftentimes as a neutral aggregator of tax data on charities. If you go there, you can find out about various charities and Christian organizations. You can see their Form 990. You can see what they pay individuals that are employees. You can see how much they spend on programs, how much they spend on fundraising, all sorts of things. But there are a lot of people that are beginning to question whether or not GuideStar is this kind of neutral aggregator of charities. And the reason is they've now begun to place hate group labels on groups that have been designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, we talked about this the other day, and if we can go back to it as well, because when we spent some time getting into it, this is an organization that one time really had some respect for the work that they were doing. They helped identify individuals that really were hate groups, neo-Nazis, skinheads, anti-Semitic groups. But as you well know, and we've talked on this program many times before, they also have now chosen to label any Christian organization, sometimes even any Christian group, that would hold to traditional family values and is critical of the LGBT community or the LGBT agenda. And some of these groups include things like the Family Research Council with Tony Perkins, or the American Family Association with Don Wildman and Tim Wildman. But it also includes groups like the American College of Pediatricians and American Freedom Defense Initiative and others. And so, again, there are some people raising certain questions about whether or not this charity, known as GuideStar, is really that neutral, because this hate group designation, first of all, will affect donations. You think? You know, if I'm going to donate to a group and I see it's a hate group, I'm going to think twice about whether or not I'm going to write a check to them. But it's also just flat dangerous, because the Southern Poverty Law Center designated, as I mentioned, Family Research Council as a hate group. And that's the reason that Floyd Kirkens actually walked into their lobby a number of years ago, intent on killing as many people as he could, simply because of this hate group designation. The guard in the lobby, fortunately, was able to stop him, although he had to take a bullet in the process to prevent what could have been a horrible massacre of the Family Research Council.
So I think if you would agree with me that it's really just outrageous that GuideStar has been using this hate labeling of a discredited left-wing organization just to tarnish the groups of Christian groups. And this is why these 46 different American organizations gathered together are writing a letter to GuideStar to actually tell them to remove the hate group designation from what is supposed to be a neutral aggregator of tax data on various charities. So again, that's just another story wanted to cover today. And when we come back, let's open up the phones for any comments on some of the issues we've addressed today. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join us, we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. $3.25 million. That's the price one New Jersey town will pay for its religious discrimination. Not long ago on this program, I told you about the refusal of Bernards Township, New Jersey, to grant a building permit to the Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey. The society fought City Hall for at least 4 years, having their application denied 9 separate times. In November 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a suit against the township, alleging a violation of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The Department of Justice won just 2 months later. But by May 2017, the township decided to give up the fight, settle with the government, and allow the Islamic Society to build their mosque. This is good news for religious liberty. Though Bernards Township, in this case, used their zoning laws to prevent the building of a mosque, it could have just as easily been a synagogue, a church, a cathedral, or other house of worship. City governments cannot intentionally throw up permitting obstacles to religious organizations. They must treat a religious organization's application for land use just like it would any other land use application. In a land that values freedom, our government should never make the free exercise of religion difficult. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Had a chance today to talk with Gary Bauer and Robert Marks, and Rahim Kasim could not join us, but I did want to give you a little bit of an update on the article that we have posted here on Point of View. So again, would encourage you to go there and find some of that information. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Another piece that came down in the news that I thought would be good to cover is the question of how many non-citizens are voting in our elections illegally. They are really, in a sense, raising some very good questions about electoral integrity. And you have one side which has, over the years, said that this is a non-existent problem. There's another side that said, this may be a problem greater than you might imagine. So the question is, who is right?
Well, a groundbreaking study that was done at Old Dominion University in Virginia attempted to try to answer that question. And it turns out that there is what is known as the Harvard YouGov study, and this is a study that asks questions of thousands of voters. And so this has been an opportunity to really look at that particular issue. And they concluded, the professors at Old Dominion, that about 2.8 million non-citizens voted in 2008. Well, you can figure that out. That could change some elections very quickly. But then the professors that were part of that Harvard YouGov study looked at that same data, and they concluded that 0 non-citizens voted in that election. Now, first of all, when you hear 0, you go, really? I mean, I think if they had at least said few or very few, but when you say 0, you really are telling me that nobody that's a non-citizen voted in that election. So that led to another group spending some time saying, well, wait a minute, let's just look at this. And this is a team known as Just Facts, and they've been looking at elections for quite some time. And what they actually did was notice that there really kind of were 2 flawed assumptions of those Harvard YouGov professors. The first is that they assumed that people who said that they voted and identified a candidate did not vote unless their name showed up in the database, because what they would do is they'll interview people and then they'll look up on the database. Think about that for a minute. You know, many people that are voting fraudulently are probably not going to use their true identity. That ever occurred to you? I mean, after all, that would then, of course, tell me that their names would obviously not show up on the database. Then the second one is, and this one really got me smiling, the Harvard researchers assumed that citizens might misidentify themselves as non-citizens, but they never assumed that a non-citizen would never misidentify themselves as a citizen. And again, really? In other words, if you know you're not a citizen of the United States, isn't it quite possible that you would identify yourself as a citizen in order to get various kinds of benefits? We know that illegal immigrants all the time claim that they are citizens in order to conceal the fact that they are in this country illegally. So the Harvard researchers assume just the opposite. Some people might be confused as to whether or not they're a citizen, even if they are, but nobody would ever, if they're not a citizen, ever say that they were a citizen. Well, that's kind of interesting, because when you go back and look at some of the polls, you can actually see that some of the people that declared that they were actually citizens were non-citizens, because we could follow what happened on the database. So all of that to get you back to the bottom line, and that is, when you rework the numbers, Just Facts concluded that back in 2008, as many as 5.7 million non-citizens voted in the 2008 election that put Barack Obama in the White House. So if that is even close to accurate, it means that illegal voting is a much bigger problem than we would possibly imagine. And here again is where I want to encourage you to be a wise discerner of news and information, because this study, the Harvard YouGov study, has been around for a while. And so you had some at Old Dominion, these professors, who concluded it was 2.8 million non-citizens voting in 2008. But then you had some of the Harvard researchers say, no, it was 0. Guess which particular study the media quotes? The one that says there were 0, not even the 2.8. Well, now when you go back and challenge some of those assumptions, the Just Facts group came up with 5.7 million. This is a really significant problem. And when we are told time and time again that a voter ID issue is not that important, this is a solution in search of a problem, we have quite a bit of evidence to suggest just the latter. Just before we wind down for today, let me again mention my commentary, which is entitled Ignorance and Intolerance. It again is the story of what happened to Russell Vought, who I'm sure will eventually be confirmed as the Deputy Director of Office of Management and Budget, but nevertheless found himself engaged in some kind of religious inquisition, first by Senator Bernie Sanders and later by Senator Chris Van Hollen. And so if you'd like to read more about that, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find that, because as we point out, Article 6 of the Constitution prohibits religious tests for public office, but that doesn't seem to matter much anymore when you have these kinds of questions being asked. And as I point out in the commentary, you don't have these kinds of questions being asked of other people besides Christians. Gary Bauer mentioned that in the first hour, but think about this. You know, Orthodox Christians obviously believe in the exclusivity of Christ, but so do the other religions that trace their heritage back to Abraham, Judaism, and Islam. They also have exclusive religious claims. So taken to its logical conclusion, the views expressed by Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Chris Van Hollen would almost have to exclude anybody who is an Orthodox follower of the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. And I think a lot of that has to do with ignorance, and that is, as I point out, elites in the media, in government, and the university really have a contempt for Christians in general and evangelicals in particular, but they really don't even have an interest in trying to understand Christian theology, and because of that, in many cases, that ignorance leads to intolerance. So that's my commentary for today, and it's all available to you on the website pointofview.net. Let me just encourage you as we come to the end of the program today to go to your computer. If you have access to a computer, go to our website, pointofview.net, and click on that button that says Give Now. Or if you'd like to give us a call, the pledge line number is 800-347-5151. Really trying to equip you to make a stand in the culture, to ultimately recognize that we live in a world that has sort of become almost a post-truth culture. So we're trying to provide, if you will, your one-stop source for the latest news and information and commentary, to cut through some of the information and misinformation, and to recognize that we really are moving into a culture that oftentimes is challenging biblical faith. So we not only want you to be able to articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend a biblical worldview. So that's why I ask you to consider what you might do, even as we come to the end of the program today, to visit the website pointofview.net and make your pledge, or to go to our pledge line number 800-347-5151. And as I've shared with you before, we do have a matching challenge, so that's a way in which you can see your gift of $100 becoming $200. We have a button there for a gift of $250 that would be as much as $500. And so please take the time to visit the website or give us a call and to make your pledge. Tomorrow we're going to get back into some other very important issues in the news. Of course, Wednesday is our Millennial Roundtable, and all the way till Friday, our Friday weekend edition. Each day, I hope you'll join us here on Point of View, and also visit the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Elisa, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
When you invest in Point of View Radio in July, that's a good thing. The reality is, like you, our bills keep coming every week, every month. But as we close in on the end of June this week, I encourage you to step up now. Number one, because our fiscal year ends Friday, and next year's agenda, the plans we've already developed and hope to accomplish, depend on what happens now. Number two, I encourage you to give now because another listener, one who might have greater means than you or I do, will match what you give, doubling the impact up to $10,000. If you can also give $10,000, we'll put it to very fruitful and good use, and the matching gift will multiply the impact. But whether you give in 5 figures with or without a decimal point, please give this week. Visit pointofview.net and click on Bridge the Great Divide, or call 1-800-347-5151. We are down to the final days. We need you to step up now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.